What I'm going to talk about is a center that I run in Pittsburgh on the north side. And I think that somebody's going to run some slides. Is that correct? Okay. That's what I do for a living. And it's a place called Bidwell Training Center and Manchester Craftsman's Guild. And it really represents my sort of legacy. The center's 50 years old as of last year. And it started off as a very modest center during the riots in Pittsburgh. And through providence or accident, I was selected to try to make this into an asset from a liability. So I took over the Bidwell Training Center, and it quite literally had $112 in the bank when I took it over. And we've done a lot more with it than that, as we now are a multi-million-dollar corporation with a pretty good track record, and I think a brighter history. Manchester is the arts program that I founded based on my own personal experience with a public school teacher who literally saved my life. African-American kid, flunking out of public school. Art teacher hounds me until I fill out an application at the University of Pittsburgh, in pencil, I might add. Put the thing in an envelope, sent it to Pitt. They let me in on probation. I was one of the first affirmative action kids let into Pitt on probation. And I'm very pleased to tell you I graduated from Pitt with honors, and now I'm a trustee of the place. More importantly, I was the commencement speaker. And I got up in front of 13,000 people and said, don't give up on the poor kids, they might end up being the commencement speaker. And for the few minutes I'm up here, that's the story. People are born into the world as assets, not liabilities. And what I figured out is that principle. And so I built this training center to reflect that. Next slide. That's what I built. This is my idea of what a school for poor people is supposed to look like. This is in the highest crime rate neighborhood, admittedly in Pittsburgh, my neighborhood. And I built it as a model actually for the old Pittsburgh airport. The precast concrete systems for the Pittsburgh airport were developed in my building. Same architect who was trained by a guy named Frank Lloyd Wright. And so it's a very famous building. It's worn very well. And the other thing that I'm really proud of is that we have had no act of theft, vandalism, or violence in 50 years of operation. Zero. No racial incidents. And you can come to my center and see $200,000 worth of artwork appraised value on the walls with no anti-theft system. We haven't lost a screwdriver in 40 years. That's not an accident. That's called a strategy. What we figured out is that the only thing wrong with poor kids is they don't have any money, which happens to be a curable condition. It's all in the way that you think about people that drives behavior. So if you think about kids as assets and treat them that way, guess what? More often than not, they're going to behave like assets. If you treat them like prisoners, they're going to behave like prisoners. Now, why all the PhDs running around in education haven't figured out that principle remains a mystery. But I figured it out, and we're building a brand based on that insight, that the only thing wrong with poor kids is the environment that they've grown up in and oftentimes how they've been treated. And so I have built a business model based on those principles. Next slide. That's lunch at our school, by the way. This is what the kids eat every day. We discovered it's very difficult to teach people when they're hungry. So the answer is give them something to eat. But since we don't do fast food at our place, we do gourmet food. Every student at the Bidwell Training Center has a gourmet lunch every day. Good for their stomachs and better for their heads. I wanted to take the stigma out of food. Good food for everybody on the planet, not just rich kids. And if people tell you that you can't serve gourmet food to poor kids, send them to the north side. I've been doing it for 30 years. You just have to want to do it bad enough. So I challenge all the educators in this room as to why they can't serve their kids food like that every day when they go to school. No one has yet given me a satisfactory reason why you can't do it. And there's no appreciable difference in costs between that food and fast food. I know because I did the numbers. And the reason I know how to do the numbers is the Heinz Ketchup Company built us $1 million kitchen so I could stand up here and prove this concept to you. And the guy who built that was a fellow named John Heinz. And he decided to give me $1 million so I could build a gourmet kitchen that served gourmet food to poor kids on the north side of Pittsburgh. So this legacy is John Heinz's legacy to the citizens of Pittsburgh. Next slide. And these are some of our culinary students. Oh, by the way, we have a 100% placement rate with our graduates. Everybody that graduates from the program goes to work. Every class for the last 15 classes. Why? Because there's nothing wrong with the kids. What's wrong is the attitude that we provide the children. And so what I've figured out is environment drives behavior. Beautiful environments create beautiful kids, and prisons create prisoners. So if you can figure that one out, we may have a chance of turning this conversation around. Next slide. I also train chemical technicians for, you've heard of Covestro and Bayer? Well, I train technicians for all those guys. You come over to my school, I'll show you poor people doing chemical applications in 12 months with no background in math, for real. I have 80 of them working for the Covestro Corporation right now, right on the Parkway. The point of the story is, the only thing wrong with poor kids from what we can determine is they don't have people who believe that they have the ability to do world-class technology. Well, I believe it. And as the result of that, we have people now working for every technology company in Western Pennsylvania who came from my center. Next slide. And we also believe in the arts. And by the way, I increased the graduation rate 20% for every kid that goes to our arts program for the last 20 years. 20%. That kid happens to be going to Penn State. His brother's already there. Next slide. And look at that child. Next slide. And the guy that took that picture is now working for Walt Disney Studios. Next slide. And that happens to be a digital imaging center. And the reason that it's in my slide presentation is, in the old days, as Doris will tell you, I actually had y'all remember what slide projectors look like? Well, I actually had one of those with duct tape on the corner of the box. And I got invited to a place called the Silicon Valley. So I showed up with my slide projector, and these people looked at me like I was from Pluto, man. But that's cool. I blew off the dust, plugged in a little slide projector, got up and told my story. And this kid come out of the audience, he said, "Man, that was a heck of a story." I said, "That's cool, man. What do you do for a living?" He said, "Oh, I built a company called eBay." I said, "Oh, that's great. You got a card?" I didn't know eBay from this microphone. So I went back to Pittsburgh and asked one of the little techie kids, I said, "Have you ever heard of something called eBay?" He said, "Yeah, Mr. Strickland, that's the Electronic Commerce Network." I said, "Holy smokes, I met the guy that built the company." So I called him up and I said, "Mr. Skull, I've come to have a much deeper appreciation of who you are, man." And he said, "I thought you'd figure it out sooner or later." Here's $1 million, which he gave me. And I said to this guy, Jeff Skoll, why are you giving me $1 million? He said, because I think you can scale this concept globally, and I'm making my bet now. And so Jeff became a good friend. He did found eBay. He remains a good friend, and he is the reason why we're scaling this idea. Next slide. Oh, by the way, we built a music hall, and a fellow named Dizzy Gillespie showed up. And I said, why did you come here? He said, Herbie Hancock told me a black guy built this center, and I didn't believe him, want to see for myself. And he said, you ought to build one of these things in every community in the country. And to help you do it, I'm going to allow you to record the concert. And so we recorded Dizzy Gillespie with his permission. And so we now have won 5 Grammys. We have the highest win rate of any small record company in the world in a black neighborhood on the north side of Pittsburgh. Next slide. Oh, I also got into flowers. I like flowers. And one of my buddies says, you're going to do what on the north side? I said, I'm going to grow orchids. And they started laughing, and I said, well, that's cool. You can keep laughing. I'm going to build that greenhouse anyway. Well, as it turns out, we did build the greenhouse. And now we're selling every orchid that we grow in production on the north side of Pittsburgh. And it's become a business. We're actually now making money growing orchids on the north side. And we took first place in the Home and Garden Show. Our guys. Next slide. Next slide. Oh, we're also growing hydrangeas. And a giant eagle bought the whole crop. They bought 5,000 hydrangeas off of us. The trailer truck drove up and bought the whole crop. So we're now in the hydrangea business. Next slide. And this is my next move. I'm going into the tomato propagation business. And before you start laughing, that's what they said when I built the facility that's now selling every orchid that it grows on the north side of Pittsburgh. And we're now selling poinsettias, and we think we're going to grow hydroponic tomatoes, and we think we can sell them to all the retail grocers in Pennsylvania at least. And I think we can do it, and I think we can generate a lot of revenue to support the school that created it in the first place. Stay tuned on that one. Next slide. Oh, remember that Mr. Skoll, the guy from eBay? He said that I could start replicating my center. Well, I am. And part of the reason I like being on the board of UPMC is wherever Romoff goes, I go. He wants to go to Rome, I want to go to Rome. He wants to go to Ireland, I'm going to Ireland. So what I ended up doing was replicating the business model, Rob, that Jeff articulated at them board meetings. I was taking notes, all right, about how to scale this concept. And so we now have 4 cases at the Harvard Business School. Trivial pursuit question of the day. Who are the only 2 individuals ever to get 4 cases at the Harvard Business School? Well, I'm one of them. And the other was a guy named Steve Jobs. I want to write the 5th case. And that case will be, how does Bill Strickland build centers all over the world? So I now have 12 centers open and operating, including Israel, by the way. We have one open and operating in Israel for Palestinians and Jews. They're going to school together and they're getting along fine. Next slide. Akko, Israel. Oh, that's Shimon Peres. I was with him 6 months before he died. And I met him in his office in just outside of Haifa. And he said 2 words to me, keep going. And so this center is now open and operating and thriving for Palestinians and Jews in Israel today. Next slide. We also are now building centers. We're going to build 4 more in Pennsylvania in the next 2 years. Erie's teed up, Titusville's teed up, Lancaster's teed up, Westmoreland County's teed up. So we're going to add 4 more to the group of 12 that are already open and operating, all of which, by the way, are getting the same outcomes as Pittsburgh in every center. By the way, every center looks like Pittsburgh, and none of them have armed guards in the facilities. I don't have an armed guard in my facility. We haven't lost a screwdriver in 40 years of operation. Nothing. It's attitude and it's values. That's the solution to the cancer. That's the business model. Next slide. And I got a book out called Make the Impossible Possible. It tells this whole story. And so right now we have commitments from Puerto Rico, Vancouver. If some of you are reading the newspaper, I was with the Dalai Lama 2 weeks ago in India and never wanted to miss an opportunity for a sale. I was with His Holiness, and the smart money said, build the center in India. And I said to the Dalai Lama, and Peduto can testify because he was sitting right next to me, we're going to build one in Tibet because you're the Dalai Lama for the Tibetan people. He let out an exclamation of joy that was startling to his people because he thought I was going to take the safe bet. And I said, no, the name of my book is Make the Impossible Possible. We're going to build it in Tibet, but you got to come cut the ribbon. And Bill Peduto was sitting right there and saw it. And so it's game on for Tibet. Also, we have now a conversation with San Juan, as I had mentioned, but I think we're going to be in Haiti pretty soon. We have an early conversation in Belfast, Ireland. We have an early conversation in London. And I think that we have the capacity to scale this globally, is what I'm trying to tell you. So what I've done is taken entrepreneurial principles and I've turned them into businesses. So what I've been able to do is to demonstrate that if you can run a nonprofit effectively, you're basically transferring those experiences to the entrepreneurial side of the street. So I've shrunk the line between liabilities and assets so that it's almost invisible because it's fundamentally the same process. That's why I won something called a MacArthur Fellowship, because I figured out how entrepreneurs think and I turned it into a business. Let me give you the statistics. In Pennsylvania, it costs about $40,000 a year to lock people up in the penitentiary, most of whom look like me. $17,000 to go to our vocational school. 3 years of education generates enough revenue that it pays back the initial investment in 36 months. Do the math. This is a math problem. In other words, it's called a business. If I can, for 50% less money, give you 3 times the return, that's a business. And that's what I figured out. And that's why I believe that we're on to a very, very big idea. It costs a lot of money to keep people poor, by the way. If you add up the drug programs, okay, the counseling programs, the drug rehabilitation programs, et cetera, it costs a lot of money to keep people poor. And so what I'm trying to show you is there's a solution, a business solution to this problem. So forget Republican and Democrat, we are way past that. I'm introducing a new concept. It's called common sense. It happens to be in very short supply in our country right now. But I think it's common sense that's going to get us home. In fact, I believe it so much that I am almost certain that if, based on our trajectory, we're going to have at least 100 centers open and operating in the next 5 to 10 years. And we're going to pay attention to the very thing that you talked about, which is making sure that you don't go too far from home. That we make sure that we take the temperature of each center. So I have a team of 8 people now who monitor the performance of each of the centers. And we're going to be able to do that, we think, globally before this is over. And so I think what you're looking at is the beginning of a very different strategy that we're trying to introduce to the not-for-profit sector. And I think that you minority entrepreneurs can learn from this model because fundamentally, I'm a minority entrepreneur. At the end of the day, that's what this story is. This is a minority entrepreneurial story, disguised as a training center. But the outcomes and the performance are there, the metrics are there, the Form 990s are as good as it gets. And so we've checked off all the boxes. And we think that this could be a very, very exciting way to envision a very, very different path for our country and certainly for the community. And so far, we've got bipartisan support on this concept, Republicans and Democrats in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania could be the state that leads the nation in how to do this in all 49 states. And that's what I'm really after. And so with some luck and a little encouragement, I think we may end up expanding this story, and it could end up becoming a very, very big deal before it's over. So why don't I just maybe stop there? And I think that gives you a flavor of how we think, and more importantly, where we're headed. So thank you very much.